On December 13th, 2003, investigators in New Jersey made an arrest that would expose one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Charles Cullen, a registered nurse, had killed up to 40 patients over 16 years. But here's what made seasoned detectives' blood run cold. Cullen claimed he was helping them. He said he was relieving suffering. He said he was teaching hospitals to recognize when patients were in distress. Sound familiar? Before we begin, let me be absolutely clear. Jigsaw, also known as John Kramer, is a fictional character created by James Wan and Lee Wannell for the Saw franchise. But I'm going to show you the real criminal psychology of mission-oriented killers, the documented cases of torture motivated by ideology, and the disturbing phenomenon of offenders who claim moral authority while causing death. This isn't about one true story. It's about patterns documented across multiple real cases that inspired elements of this fictional character. Strip away the reverse bear traps and bathroom games, and what remains is a composite portrait of some of the most dangerous offender types studied by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Mission-oriented killers who rationalize murder as moral instruction. Medical professionals with God complexes who decide who deserves to live. Torture-motivated offenders who engineer elaborate methods of suffering, and charismatic manipulators who recruit accomplices to carry on their twisted legacy. Every single element exists in documented criminal history. So here's the question that keeps forensic psychiatrists awake at night. Can someone genuinely believe they're helping people while systematically causing their deaths? Or is moral justification simply the most sophisticated mask a killer can wear? Let me show you what the case files reveal. In the fictional Saw universe, John Kramer's philosophy centers on a single paradox. I've never killed anyone. I give people a choice. He claims to value life by forcing victims to fight for survival. He positions himself as a teacher, not a murderer. This isn't creative fiction. It's a documented psychological pattern. The FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime classifies mission-oriented killers as offenders who believe they're ridding the world of a particular group or teaching a specific lesson through their crimes. Unlike hedonistic killers motivated by pleasure, mission-oriented offenders construct elaborate moral frameworks to justify their actions. And here's what the data shows. They genuinely believe it. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist who created a 22-level scale of evil based on analyzing over 600 murderers, found that mission-oriented killers often score lower on traditional psychopathy assessments than disorganized killers. Why? Because they're not devoid of conscience. They've restructured their moral reasoning to accommodate violence. They've convinced themselves they're the good guys. Let me give you a real example that mirrors Jigsaw's philosophy almost perfectly. Harold Shipman was a British general practitioner who killed at least 250 patients between 1975 and 1998, making him one of history's most prolific serial killers. But Shipman didn't see himself as a murderer. According to psychiatric evaluations conducted after his arrest, Shipman believed he was making medical decisions about quality of life. He was ending suffering. He was playing God with a stethoscope. Sound familiar? Dr. David Wilson, a criminologist who studied Shipman's case extensively, noted that Shipman exhibited what he called malignant altruism, the psychological phenomenon where someone commits harm while genuinely believing they're providing help. Shipman's patients trusted him. He held their lives in his hands, and according to his own twisted logic, he was merciful. Now here's where it gets disturbing. Research published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences examined 47 medical serial killers and found that 68% claimed some form of mercy or moral justification for their crimes. Janine Jones, a pediatric nurse who killed up to 60 infants, said she was helping them get to heaven. Orville Lynn Majors, who murdered at least 6 patients, claimed he was ending their suffering. These aren't isolated incidents. It's a pattern. But here's the question that haunts forensic psychiatrists. Do they truly believe their justifications, or is it post hoc rationalization to avoid facing what they really are? Dr. Albert Bandura, a psychologist who pioneered research on moral disengagement, identified 8 cognitive mechanisms that allow people to commit harmful acts without experiencing guilt. One of the most powerful is moral justification, reconstructing harmful conduct as serving a moral purpose. In documented cases, mission-oriented killers don't just use this mechanism. They build entire philosophical systems around it. Leonard Lake, who tortured and killed at least 11 people in California during the 1980s, left behind videotapes explaining his philosophy. He called it Operation Miranda, his plan to survive nuclear war by enslaving women. But listen to how he framed it: as preparation, as foresight, as ensuring human survival. He positioned himself as a visionary, not a monster. Charles Ng, Lake's accomplice, later testified that Lake genuinely believed his own philosophy. He'd spent years developing it, writing about it, convincing himself that torture and murder were means to a righteous end. Now here's what changes everything. The fictional Jigsaw didn't wake up one day and decide to build death traps. He had a trigger, a terminal cancer diagnosis that made him reassess the value of life. And when investigators examine real mission-oriented killers, they find similar triggering events in a significant percentage of cases, but not the way you'd expect. Stay with me, because what the research reveals is both tragic and terrifying. In 1999, Dr. Michael Swango was arrested at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. He was a physician who had poisoned at least 4 patients and colleagues, though investigators believe the true number exceeds 60 victims. But here's the critical detail. Swango's killing escalated dramatically after he was diagnosed with a serious medical condition that threatened his career. When faced with his own mortality and loss of control, Swango's need to control the mortality of others intensified. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychology professor who has studied the intersection of terminal illness and violent crime, found that while terminal diagnosis rarely creates violent offenders, it can accelerate existing pathology in individuals already predisposed to control-seeking behavior. The psychological term is mortality salience. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology demonstrates that reminding people of their own death causes measurable changes in behavior. For most people, mortality salience leads to increased altruism and connection-seeking. But for individuals with narcissistic or antisocial traits, confronting death can trigger desperate attempts to assert dominance and create legacy. They want to prove they still have power when biology says they don't. In the fictional Saw narrative, John Kramer's cancer diagnosis transforms him from a civil engineer into a philosophical killer. But here's what makes this psychologically accurate. His methods reflect his profession, and that pattern exists in documented cases. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was a mathematician who built increasingly sophisticated mail bombs over 17 years. His technical expertise shaped his methodology. Jeffrey MacDonald, a physician convicted of murdering his family, staged the crime scene with medical precision. BTK killer Dennis Rader worked in compliance and used systematic stalking methods that reflected his professional mindset. When technically minded individuals become violent offenders, their expertise becomes weaponized. David Parker Ray, known as the Toy Box Killer, was a mechanic who built an elaborate torture chamber inside a soundproof trailer. He engineered pulleys, surgical tools, and restraint systems with the same precision he'd used to rebuild an engine. Ray kept detailed diagrams and schematics. He tested equipment. He refined his methods over decades. Now here's the disturbing part. When FBI agents analyzed Ray's audio recordings, he made tapes to play for victims, describing what would happen to them. They found something unexpected. Ray framed his torture as instruction. He told victims he was teaching them their place. He positioned himself as educator, not simply sadist. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Dr. Louis Schlesinger, a professor of forensic psychology, studied what he calls sexually motivated torture murderers and found that many construct elaborate philosophical justifications for their actions. It's not enough to simply torture. They need their victims to understand the lesson. But here's where terminal illness creates a unique psychological pressure. In a study of violent offenders published in Aggression and Violent Behavior, researchers found that individuals facing terminal diagnosis who subsequently committed violence showed a specific pattern. They viewed their crimes as legacy acts. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their philosophy to outlive their body. Sound familiar? In the Saw franchise, Jigsaw obsesses over legacy. He recruits apprentices. He creates elaborate video messages. He ensures his work continues after his death. In real criminal history, this exact pattern is evident. Charles Manson didn't personally kill Sharon Tate or the LaBiancas, but he orchestrated the murders and created a philosophy that outlived him. Marshall Applewhite, leader of the Heaven's Gate cult, convinced 38 followers to commit suicide based on his teachings. Jim Jones recorded his final sermon while 909 people died at Jonestown. These offenders shared a common trait. They believed their ideology was more important than individual lives, including their own. Dr. Mark Sageman, a forensic psychiatrist who studied radicalization, calls this cosmic war mentality, the belief that you're fighting for ultimate truth against ultimate evil. When someone adopts this mindset, individual deaths become acceptable casualties in the service of the greater mission. They're not killers, they're soldiers, philosophers, teachers. At least that's what they tell themselves. Now let me show you the neuroscience of what's actually happening in their brains, because recent research reveals something shocking about how mission-oriented killers process moral decisions. In 2011, researchers at King's College London conducted brain scans on violent offenders with varying levels of psychopathy. What they found challenges everything we thought we knew about how killers think. Offenders with high psychopathy showed reduced activity in the amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortex when processing moral dilemmas. Their brains literally didn't activate emotional processing during moral decisions. However, what surprised the researchers was this. Mission-oriented offenders, those who claim moral justification for their crimes, showed different brain activity patterns. Their emotional processing centers were activated normally. Instead, they showed increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region associated with complex reasoning and rationalization. Their brains weren't broken. They were working overtime to justify their actions. Dr. Kent Keel, a neuroscientist who has scanned the brains of over 4,000 inmates, explains it this way. Psychopaths don't feel empathy, so they don't need to rationalize causing harm. But mission-oriented offenders do feel empathy, which means they need elaborate cognitive frameworks to override it. They have to convince themselves that torture serves a higher purpose. And that's where the God complex comes in. Harold Shipman, the doctor who killed 250 patients, underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation. The assessment revealed something chilling. Shipman didn't exhibit traditional sadism. He didn't enjoy suffering. Instead, he experienced what psychiatrists call omnipotent narcissism, the belief that he alone could make life or death decisions. He played God with morphine instead of lightning bolts. The medical profession, ironically, creates perfect conditions for God complex development. Doctors make constant decisions about life and death. They're treated with deference. Patients trust them implicitly. For someone predisposed to narcissistic traits, that power becomes intoxicating. Michael Swango, the physician who poisoned patients, kept a scrapbook of natural disasters and accidents. He was fascinated by death, but specifically by death that appeared natural or accidental. When investigators searched his apartment, they found he'd written in his journal, "He who does not have power over life and death is not a true physician." He genuinely believed murder was part of medical practice. Now compare this to the fictional Jigsaw's philosophy. He doesn't kill directly. His victims kill themselves through their choices. He positions himself outside the actual mechanism of death while orchestrating every detail. This isn't creative writing, it's documented psychological distancing. Dr. Robert Simon, a clinical professor of psychiatry, studied how killers maintain psychological distance from their victims. He identified what he calls instrumentalization, treating victims as tools or teaching materials rather than humans. Medical serial killers excel at this because they're trained to view bodies clinically. But what about torture-motivated offenders who don't have medical backgrounds? David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, worked as a mechanic. He wasn't trained in medicine, but he studied anatomy. He learned pain thresholds. He treated torture as engineering problem-solving. According to FBI behavioral analyst John Douglas, Ray spent thousands of hours planning and refining his methods. The level of preparation is what separates mission-oriented killers from impulsive violent offenders. Research published in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology found that mission-oriented killers spend an average of 6 to 18 months planning their first kill, compared to days or hours for disorganized offenders. They acquire specialized knowledge, they test equipment, they create contingency plans. It's not crime, it's project management. Leonard Lake, who tortured victims in a remote California compound, kept detailed journals of his philosophy. He called it Operation Miranda and spent years developing the theoretical framework before committing his first murder. Charles Ng later testified that Lake treated torture as a thought experiment made real. Now here's the question that forensic psychiatrists struggle to answer. Is the elaborate philosophy genuine belief, or is it sophisticated manipulation to justify sadism? Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated multiple serial killers, argues it's both. He explains that mission-oriented killers often start with genuine ideological beliefs, but as they kill, the ideology evolves to accommodate increasingly extreme actions. The philosophy becomes whatever it needs to be to justify the next torture session. It's a feedback loop of rationalization. But here's where things get truly disturbing. Some mission-oriented killers don't work alone. They recruit others. They spread their philosophy like a virus. And the psychology of how charismatic killers find accomplices reveals something terrifying about human susceptibility to malignant influence. Stay with me, because what happened in these documented cases will make you question how well you really know the people around you. In 1969, Charles Manson sent his followers to commit murders based on nothing more than his philosophical ramblings about race war and Beatles lyrics. These weren't vulnerable cult members isolated in a compound. They were young people from middle-class backgrounds who became willing participants in brutal killings within months of meeting Manson. How does someone recruit accomplices to murder? Dr. Robert Hare, the psychologist who created the psychopathy checklist, studied charismatic offenders and identified a specific skill set they share. They're not necessarily the most intelligent or physically imposing. Instead, they excel at what he calls impression management, creating and maintaining a carefully crafted persona that appeals to specific psychological needs. They find broken people and offer belonging. Manson recruited young people experiencing identity crises. He provided structure, purpose, and the feeling of being part of something significant. Within the Manson family, members weren't criminals. They were revolutionaries, philosophers, the enlightened few who understood hidden truth. Sound familiar? In the Saw franchise, Jigsaw recruits Amanda Young, a former victim who becomes his apprentice. He finds someone traumatized and vulnerable, then gives her purpose through his philosophy. She doesn't see herself as a murderer. She's continuing important work. This pattern appears across multiple documented cases. Leonard Lake recruited Charles Ng by appealing to Ng's resentment and offering a vision of total freedom from social constraints. According to court testimony, Lake spent months building the relationship before revealing his true intentions. He tested Ng's boundaries gradually, normalizing increasingly extreme ideas. Dr. Mark Sageman, who studied terrorist recruitment, calls this progressive commitment. People don't join extremist groups planning to kill. They join seeking community, then gradually accept increasingly extreme positions through a series of small escalations. It's the boiling frog methodology applied to moral corruption. But here's what makes mission-oriented killer recruitment particularly insidious. Traditional criminal partnerships are often transactional. Accomplices participate for money, protection, or other concrete benefits. But mission-oriented killers recruit ideological followers. They offer meaning, purpose, and the intoxicating feeling of moral superiority. They make murder feel righteous. Folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder, is a recognized psychiatric condition where delusional beliefs transfer from one person to another through close association. While rare, documented cases show it can occur with violent ideation. The Eriksson twins case in Sweden demonstrated this phenomenon. Ursula and Sabina Eriksson exhibited sudden, identical psychotic symptoms simultaneously, resulting in violent behavior that included attempted suicide and murder. Psychiatric evaluation concluded they developed shared delusional beliefs. Now imagine that dynamic, but with a charismatic leader deliberately cultivating those beliefs. Dr. Louis West, a psychiatrist who studied cult dynamics, explained that charismatic leaders exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities: need for certainty, desire for belonging, and hunger for purpose. They provide simple answers to complex questions. They create in-group-out-group dynamics. They position themselves as uniquely enlightened. Manson told followers he understood hidden messages in Beatles songs. Jim Jones claimed he was the reincarnation of Lennon and Jesus. Marshall Applewhite convinced followers they'd ascend to a spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. The specific delusion matters less than the psychological mechanism it activates. In documented cases of mission-oriented killers with accomplices, researchers found a consistent pattern. The leader frames violence as necessary sacrifice for a greater good. Individual suffering becomes acceptable because it serves the mission. It's the same cognitive mechanism that allows soldiers to kill in war or revolutionaries to justify terrorism. But mission-oriented killers create their own private wars with self-appointed missions. They're all generals in conflicts only they can see. Now here's where modern technology adds a terrifying dimension. Before the internet, charismatic killers needed physical access to potential recruits. Charles Manson met followers through personal interactions. Leonard Lake placed classified ads to find victims and potential accomplices. Their reach was geographically limited. Today, violent ideologies spread globally in seconds. The FBI's 2022 report on domestic terrorism noted increasing cases of individuals radicalized entirely online, adopting violent philosophies from anonymous forums and manifestos. They develop elaborate justifications for potential violence without ever meeting the ideology's originator. It's mission-oriented killing as open-source software. Elliot Rodger, who killed 6 people in Isla Vista in 2014, left behind a 137-page manifesto explaining his philosophy. That document has since been referenced by multiple other attackers. He's dead, but his ideology infected others. Legacy through corruption. In the Saw franchise, Jigsaw's obsession with legacy drives him to recruit multiple apprentices, create video messages, and engineer a philosophy that outlives him. The later films show that philosophy mutating and spreading beyond his control. That's psychologically accurate. Dr. J. Reed Malloy, a forensic psychologist who studies violent extremism, explains that mission-oriented ideologies often radicalize beyond the founder's original intent. Followers interpret the philosophy through their own pathology, creating increasingly extreme variations. It's a game of telephone played with justifications for murder. But here's the fundamental question that forensic psychiatry still can't definitively answer. Do mission-oriented killers genuinely believe their philosophical justifications, or do they cynically manipulate others while knowing the truth? The evidence suggests both occur. Some offenders show consistent beliefs across years of documented behavior. Harold Shipman never admitted guilt or showed remorse. Charles Manson maintained his worldview until death. They seem to genuinely inhabit their constructed reality. But others show cracks in the facade. David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, reportedly told his accomplice Cindy Hendy that the philosophy he explained to victims was just talk to scare them. He understood it was manipulation, but used it anyway. Ted Bundy gave interviews explaining he was studying criminal psychology and violence in media. He positioned himself as academic observer even while facing execution for murdering at least 30 women. Was that genuine self-delusion or calculated legacy management? We may never know. What we do know is this: mission-oriented killers represent one of the most dangerous offender profiles because their ideology provides infinite justification for escalating violence. There's always another lesson to teach, another person who doesn't appreciate life, another recruit who needs guidance. The mission never ends. Now let me bring you back to where we started, because understanding this psychology isn't just academic exercise. It has critical implications for recognizing these patterns before violence occurs. Remember Charles Cullen, the nurse who killed up to 40 patients while claiming he was helping them? Here's what you need to understand about his case. Cullen worked at 9 different hospitals over 16 years. He was fired or asked to resign from multiple positions. Colleagues reported suspicious patient deaths, yet he continued moving between facilities, continuing to kill, Because no one connected the pattern. Why? Because mission-oriented killers are expert at appearing normal, even helpful. Cullen was described as quiet, dedicated, and caring by most colleagues. He worked extra shifts. He volunteered for difficult assignments. His mask was nearly perfect. But there were warning signs. Dr. Eric Hickey, who maintains a database of over 3,400 serial killers, identified common pre-offense indicators for mission-oriented offenders. They include expressing strong ideological beliefs about who deserves to live or die, exhibiting God-complex traits in professional settings, showing unusual interest in others' suffering while claiming concern, and maintaining rigid moral frameworks that place themselves as arbiter. These aren't definitive markers. Plenty of people with strong beliefs never harm anyone. But in combination with access to vulnerable populations and opportunity for private action, they create risk profiles. The problem is that these traits can look like dedication or moral conviction. Harold Shipman was voted Doctor of the Year by his community before his arrest. Patients loved him. He made house calls. He seemed deeply committed to their well-being, right up until he injected them with lethal doses of morphine. This is why forensic psychologists emphasize the importance of systemic oversight rather than relying on individual judgment. Medical serial killers thrive in environments where one person has unsupervised access to vulnerable individuals and life-ending tools. The same applies to other mission-oriented offender scenarios. After the Jonestown Massacre, cult researchers developed assessment criteria for high-control groups. Red flags include charismatic leader who claims special enlightenment, progressively isolating members from outside contact, creating us versus them mentality, and demanding increasingly extreme demonstrations of commitment. But here's the challenge. These patterns become obvious only in retrospect. Charles Manson's followers didn't recognize they were joining a murder cult. They thought they'd found community and purpose. Each small step toward violence seemed justified by the previous step. It's the same progressive commitment that allows ordinary people to participate in atrocities throughout history. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment, argues that situational factors can overcome individual morality when authority figures provide philosophical justification for harmful actions. His research on the Lucifer effect demonstrates how good people can commit evil acts when those acts are reframed as serving higher purposes. Mission-oriented killers are masters of reframing. They transform murder into mercy, torture into teaching, control into care, and sometimes they convince themselves so thoroughly that they pass polygraph tests while lying. The fictional Jigsaw operates in horror movie reality, where his elaborate traps work perfectly and victims face clear moral tests. But strip away the cinematic elements and you're left with something far more disturbing: a composite portrait of documented offender types who exist in actual criminal history. The doctor who decides which patients deserve life, the engineer who weaponizes technical expertise, the philosopher who justifies murder as moral instruction, the charismatic manipulator who recruits accomplices, the terminal patient who seeks legacy through ideology. Every element exists, not in one person, but across multiple documented cases spanning decades of forensic research. So what does this mean for prevention? Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who has interviewed numerous violent offenders, argues that early intervention requires recognizing cognitive distortions before they calcify into justifications for violence. When someone begins constructing elaborate philosophical frameworks that devalue certain human lives or position themselves as uniquely qualified to make life-death decisions, that's a warning sign. But intervention is complicated. Many mission-oriented killer traits overlap with traits of activists, religious leaders, and social reformers. The difference lies not in having strong beliefs, but in whether those beliefs accommodate violence against individuals. The critical question becomes, what do you do when individual rights conflict with your ideology? Healthy moral frameworks acknowledge this tension and prioritize avoiding harm. Distorted frameworks resolve it by declaring certain people expendable for the greater good. That's the line between passionate advocate and potential mission-oriented offender. Now here's what keeps forensic psychiatrists up at night. We live in an age of increasing ideological polarization. online radicalization, and access to information about historical violent offenders. Someone interested in mission-oriented killing can study detailed case files, trial transcripts, and manifestos with a few searches. The next generation of mission-oriented killers won't need to invent their philosophies from scratch. They can download them. Dr. Mary Ellen O'Toole, a retired FBI profiler, warns that violent ideologies spreading online create new challenges for threat assessment. Traditional profiling assumes killers develop their methods gradually through personal experience. But today's offenders can accelerate that process by learning from predecessors' documented mistakes. It's collective knowledge applied to violence. The Saw films dramatize this through Jigsaw's apprentices, each interpreting his philosophy differently and creating new torture methods. In actual criminal psychology, we see similar patterns of ideological evolution and mutation. So how do we identify potential mission-oriented offenders before they act? The truth is, we often can't. Many individuals with concerning beliefs never act violently. Many who do act show no obvious warning signs to casual observers. The intersection of ideology, opportunity, and individual pathology remains difficult to predict. What we can do is create systemic safeguards. In medical settings, mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths, robust oversight of medication access, and peer review of patient outcomes. In ideological communities, awareness of progressive commitment patterns and intervention when groups isolate members from outside contact. In general society, education about moral disengagement mechanisms and critical thinking about philosophical frameworks that devalue human life. But ultimately, preventing mission-oriented violence requires addressing an uncomfortable truth. We're all susceptible to moral disengagement under certain conditions. Research demonstrates that ordinary people can rationalize harmful actions when provided sufficient ideological justification and social support. The Milgram experiments showed this. The Stanford prison experiment showed this. Historical atrocities show this. The difference between us and mission-oriented killers isn't that they're monsters and we're saints. It's that they encountered circumstances or developed pathologies that allowed cognitive distortions to override empathy. And in different circumstances, with different vulnerabilities, any of us could potentially follow similar paths. That's not moral relativism, it's psychological realism. Understanding mission-oriented killer psychology isn't about sympathizing with offenders. It's about recognizing the mechanisms that allow people to commit atrocities while believing they're righteous. Because only by understanding those mechanisms can we develop effective prevention and intervention strategies. So let me leave you with this question. Charles Cullen claimed he was helping patients by ending their suffering. Harold Shipman believed he was making appropriate medical decisions. Leonard Lake thought he was preparing for societal collapse. Charles Manson positioned himself as revolutionary philosopher. Do you believe they genuinely accepted their own justifications? Or was it pure manipulation wrapped in philosophical language? And more importantly, how confident are you that you'd recognize mission-oriented thinking in someone you know before it escalated to violence? The fictional Jigsaw exists in movies, but the psychology behind claiming to kill for moral reasons exists in documented case files, psychiatric evaluations, and ongoing FBI investigations. The traps aren't real, but the pattern is. If you found this analysis valuable, comment below with your thoughts on mission-oriented killer psychology. Do you think philosophical justification is genuine belief or calculated manipulation? And what prevention strategies do you think would be most effective? Understanding the psychology behind fictional monsters helps us recognize real patterns. Because in criminal history, the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who look like monsters. They're the ones who believe they're heroes.